Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Substack. I'm your host, Brian Ullman. Remember to visit gemstate.substack.com and subscribe. Free subscribers get multiple posts per week, while for the price of a cup of coffee each week you can support my work and get exclusive and early access to articles, videos, and podcasts just like this one. One thing you can do that costs nothing but a few moments of your time is to share this platform. Share my Substack with your like-minded friends. Share this podcast on your social media. Give it a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. I really do appreciate your help in growing this platform. Today I want to talk about why I think learning history is more important than many people realize. I believe that our society has dumbed down history to the point where many voters are generally ignorant of what came before us, which leads to being easily manipulated by politicians and news media. Last week I wrote an essay on the difference between is and ought. A lot of people try to square current events with what they think the world ought to be like, and because that doesn't line up with reality, they're surprised and outraged. Knowing how the world really is can help you understand not only what's happening now, but even to predict what's going to come next. How do you know how the world really is? It's simple. You read history. In that post, I pointed to a tweet by a supposed expert in politics who was flabbergasted that countries didn't behave according to her conception of international law. She wrote, quote, "So basically, my degree in politics and human rights was a lie and fake, because apparently some countries can absolutely do anything and everything." End quote. Her basic worldview and understanding of history were incorrect, and so she ended up surprised by events. I think this can be an issue on the right as well. How many of your friends truly expected some remarkable series of events to lead to Donald Trump being reinstated to the White House after Joe Biden was inaugurated? I know many expected Russia to lose their war in Ukraine a dozen times over in the past year and a half. Now, longtime readers know that I expected a quick Russian victory, so I'll admit that NATO's support has prolonged that war much longer than I thought it would. However, with world attention turning to Israel now, Ukraine's fate is basically sealed. News media have published numerous stories over the past few weeks implying that Zelensky needs to start talking peace whatever the cost. I believe that my initial impression will be proven correct in the long run. We've become far too lax about holding people responsible for their predictions. If a pundit gets something wrong, they should own it, but too often they simply want to move on and forget it. While that might avoid some embarrassment, it does us all a disservice because being wrong about something is actually a great learning opportunity. In May of 2022, I posted predictions for the state primary elections, and the next day I did a post-mortem, looking at what I got right, what I got wrong, and, most importantly, what did I miss that caused me to be wrong? I've tried to learn from that, rather than forget it. We need to develop the ability to look at events with an objective eye, otherwise we only hurt ourselves in the long run. Beyond enjoying it for its own sake, I appreciate history because it helps me to understand context. News and entertainment media, the line is so blurred now as to be non-existent, keep us in a state of perpetual now, where the past is a mystery, a grab bag of events to be brought out for various purposes. Feminists would have you believe that women had zero rights until about 2 weeks ago, and critical race theorists preach that American history has been nothing but oppression and discrimination. Rather than being a coherent narrative of one thing following another, history to them is a tool to be deployed in support of whatever narrative they're pushing at the time. An ignorant society is very useful to demagogues and activists. Ignorance of history allows news media and political figures to gaslight us. There's a series of memes going around left-wing social media that say that America was never great, that the supposed prosperity of the 1950s and early 60s was entirely illusory. Now, I won't claim that life was perfect back then, but there were some good things happening. More children were being born to married parents. Fathers could support a family on a single income, often with a good manufacturing job that provided retirement pensions. Church attendance was at its highest. And despite the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, people were generally happier and more satisfied with their lives than today. Like the villains in Orwell's 1984, the people who craft our news today have a vested interest in keeping us ignorant and locked into that perpetual now. Marxists have always operated by creating a problem and then providing the solution. But to do that here, they must convince us that their solution is the only way. That capitalism, free markets, a strong religious faith, strong bonds of community couldn't possibly result in societal happiness even though that's exactly what happened in our own history. I remember the first time I felt a desire to question an official narrative. I've always loved history, and enjoyed reading about current and past events. My high school history classes gave extra credit for getting the highest score on a weekly news quiz, and I always dominated those. I remember using the library computer to research the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, where the US and NATO had accused Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic of genociding the Bosnians. During my research, I stumbled upon the official website of the Serbian government, which told a different story than what I'd seen on the news. According to them, they were not engaged in genocide, but counterterrorism against Bosnian militias who were killing civilians and trafficking in drugs. Now, I didn't automatically believe them, and looking back, I still regard the claim with some skepticism. But what struck me at the time was how our news media had never even given airtime to that story. They never told us both sides. Even if it was false, it was still valuable to know the justification that the other side of the conflict was using. This one-sided reporting is still going on today. How many mainstream news outlets have explained Putin's justification for invading Ukraine? He claims that NATO broke its promises not to expand toward Russia. He's correct. He claims that the Ukrainian government's been fighting and killing ethnic Russians in the Donbass region. That's also correct. And he claims that Kiev is run by Nazis. Depends on your perspective, I suppose. In any case, though, whether or not these things are objectively true is beside the point. The American people deserve to hear all sides of a story, but instead we're fed a single narrative with the purpose of stirring us up for yet another war of choice. News media treats us like children who cannot handle any nuance. I can't see how anyone can try and make sense of the conflict in Israel without knowing at least the broad strokes of history. How the country was created in 1948. It faced immediate invasion from its Arab neighbors. It preemptively attacked its neighbors in 1967, seizing the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. It was invaded again in 1973, made peace with Egypt in 1978, returning the Sinai, and has had to deal with Hamas terrorism and Hezbollah ever since. Yet our news media reports on the conflict without mentioning any of that context, so people are surprised by the twists and turns of the plot, rather than expecting them based on what's come before. What's worse is when people get emotionally invested in something they know little about. George W. Bush told us that the Muslim terrorists who flew airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon did so because they hate our freedoms. Any discussion of the fact that America had been intervening in Middle Eastern affairs since the Carter administration and had built numerous bases throughout the region after the Gulf War was dismissed as supporting terrorism. Maybe a more open and honest discussion with a true appreciation for the lessons of history might have saved us from 20 years of pointless war, which cost thousands of American lives, many more Muslim and Christian civilians, and trillions of dollars, all for nothing in the end. There's an old saying that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's a cliché, but it's true. Our society today demonstrates the results of historical ignorance. Remember Michelle Obama claimed that the only time she was ever proud of her country was when they elected her husband president? Remember Ilhan Omar, the Somali refugee turned congresswoman from Minnesota who said that life in Trump's America was an everyday assault on people like her? News media constantly use the word extreme to mean anyone who disagrees with the consensus of their newsroom. And this has become especially prevalent here in Idaho, as political figures who have views that were considered centrist just 10 or 20 years ago are now called extreme. If you don't remember history, if you don't have the historical context of what people really thought and believed 10 or 20 years ago, then you're easily manipulated by this sort of rhetoric. The way in which news media reports on current events clearly demonstrates they either don't know history, or they're counting on the fact that their readers and viewers don't understand history. Most people only have vague ideas of what happened before. News media constantly compares our times to the handful of historical events that people have heard of. I remember Senator John Kerry in the 2004 presidential campaign constantly talked about the worst economy since the Great Depression, a phrase that was echoed by his friends in the media. While there was a slight downturn after the dot-com bubble and 9/11, the campaign and media completely ignored the recession of the early 90s, the economic crisis of the late 80s, the stagflation of the 70s, and so on. Kerry and the media counted on the fact that most Americans simply did not know their history well enough and would believe whatever the TV told them. News media often uses phrases such as unprecedented for things that are very much precedented, and vice versa. They called the January 6th protests, which were barely more than an unauthorized tour, with a couple of broken windows and scuffles here and there, worse than 9/11, worse than Pearl Harbor, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. They know that most people, due to the dumbing down of our history in our public schools, have only heard of a few historical events, so they use that ignorance to shape their narrative. Again, they do not see history as a truthful record of the past, nor as a teacher for the present, but as a set of tools for persuading us to support whatever agenda they have at any given moment. That's why they can seem to contradict themselves from story to story, because it's not about truth or consistency, but whatever the goal of that story happens to be. We were told by the legacy media that President Trump was normalizing extremism, even though his administration was not that different from Bill Clinton's Democratic presidency of 25 years ago. The party of Clinton moved so much further left in that time that what was considered center-left then is extreme right today. The media counts on people having short attention spans to keep them in the perpetual now. In 1964, they painted Barry Goldwater as an extremist, saying they missed good Republicans like Herbert Hoover and Dwight Eisenhower. 16 years later, they said Ronald Reagan was an extremist, in comparison to good Republicans like Barry Goldwater. 2008, they called the warmonger neocon John McCain a right-wing extremist. And then they did it again with Trump in 2016, this time making McCain and George W. Bush the good Republicans of yesterday. It makes you wonder if a new figure will arise in the near future that will cause our media to fondly look back on Trump as an example of a reasonable Republican. Every Republican president since Nixon has been caricatured as the next Hitler by the left. The strange thing is how quickly people forget these slanders. I remember talking to a leftist coworker a number of years ago who was dismayed by right-wing attacks on Barack Obama that compared him to Hitler. When I mentioned that leftists had done the same thing to George W. Bush, she was flummoxed, acting as if she had never heard of such a thing. Quick Google search revealed how common the Bush-Hitler meme was, but being a leftist means being ignorant of history, even recent history. Most people live in the perpetual now. The late author Michael Crichton, writer of Jurassic Park and many other fascinating books, used to talk about something called Gell-Mann amnesia. When you read a newspaper or watch the evening news, you tend to notice how reporters make mistakes in your area of expertise. If you're a legal expert, then you'll see how journalists often have no idea what they're talking about when covering stories that have to do with the law. If you know your way around technology, then it's painfully obvious when anchors do not. They get both their facts and their conclusions wrong. However, the theory goes, as soon as they move on to another subject, something that's outside your area of expertise, you just assume that whatever they said must be the truth, completely forgetting how ignorant they were just a few minutes ago. Crichton's conclusion is that the reporters who deliver our news are almost always ignorant. But we don't notice it most of the time. We trust that they're giving us an informed explanation of the facts, with both sides of the story. The same effect can be seen in the way in which news and entertainment media deals with history. Historical perspective is often lacking. There's another saying that he who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth. Our media and political leaders are feeding us hand to mouth. Learning history gives you a sense of perspective, an idea of where you fit in the great story of humanity. And that perspective is important for evaluating current events. Without an understanding of history, we are at the mercy of politicians and pundits who would manipulate us for their own gain. We must recognize what makes a line straight before we can pick out the ones that are crooked. A great example is socialism. News media often reports that socialism is becoming more popular among the young people. Our education system is clearly not doing a good job of teaching history, because if it were, then young people would understand that socialism is a failed 19th century ideology that's led to ruin wherever it's been tried. It failed in Russia, where it was implemented as Leninist communism. It failed in Cuba, where Fidel Castro managed to turn the jewel of the Caribbean into a third world society. It failed in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro turned a wealthy nation into a place where starving people ate zoo animals to survive. Nevertheless, many young people today mindlessly intone that real socialism has never been tried, or that it only failed because it was sabotaged by greedy capitalists. It's ironic that the same progressives that firmly believe that reality has a left-wing bias and that history inevitably moves leftward consider a 19th century ideology to be the future. The progressive view of history is a major conceit of the left. Their entire worldview is based on it. They assume that whatever we believe today is naturally superior to whatever people believed in the past, which is why they always accuse conservatives of wanting to turn back the clock. C.S. Lewis explained the flaw of this so-called Whig history nearly a century ago. He said, quote, "Progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turn, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man." End quote. The modern citizen is as ignorant about Nazism and fascism as they are about socialism. once again due to our failed public school system. Today, Nazi and fascist are simply epithets to be thrown against anyone on the right, despite there being few real neo-Nazis or modern fascists in our society. On the other hand, real-life socialists are never held to account for the genocides that were done in the name of their ideology. In a sane world, the hammer and sickle would be as taboo as the swastika. Yet nationalists and people on the right are constantly accused of being Nazis and fascists by folks with posters of Joseph Stalin or Che Guevara on their walls. Despite all the changes that have taken place throughout history, human nature remains the one constant. People are still people, and we still act according to the same nature. Despite our technological advances, we are still made of the same flesh as ancient Romans or medieval Europeans. If you understand this, and spend time learning history, learning the story of our people, and what came before, then you're not only immune to gaslighting from unscrupulous media and political figures, but you'll not be constantly surprised by what happens today. This is not to say we can predict the future with 100% certainty, but we can get a general idea of where things are going and how they might play out. We also developed a finely tuned nonsense meter and can tell when people are trying to blow smoke. Learning history and paying attention to current events is like a superpower in a world full of ignorance. Like a bank teller intimately familiar with real money, you're prepared for when someone tries to serve you a fake. This has been the podcast of the Gem State Substack. My name is Brian Ullman, and I'll see you next time.